Keyframes allow you to control where your object will be and what it will look like on a particular frame, but in order to really gain control over your animation, you need to be able to manipulate what happens in between the keyframes. Does an object move smoothly into position, or does it clunk? Does it bounce like a super ball, or does it thud like a bowling ball? These are the questions you can answer with the F-Curve Manager. So what I have open here is a file that has a sphere animating in it, and I've got some other copies of that sphere, and we'll talk about those in just a second. This sphere is animating with two keyframes that are having it move from left to right, and I'm looking at it in the top view. So when I hit play, you'll see that the object will move from left to right. These are just using the default keyframes. In Cinema 4D, when it makes a keyframe, it uses something called soft interpolation to try and make a smooth animation for you. So by default, this object is traveling from left to right, but it's doing a very smooth start and a very smooth stop. Let's see what that looks like in the F-Curve Manager. So to access the F-Curve Manager, it's part of the timeline. And I have the F-Curve Manager visible now, but I got there by going from the timeline back and forth. And so if I click on this keyframe button right here, I'm back in the timeline. I'm going to hit the letter H on the keyboard, which is the same thing as doing the Frame All command. If I go to the Frame menu and select Frame All, you can see that the keyboard shortcut for it is the letter H. So here in the timeline, I can see the keyframes themselves. The F-Curve Manager allows me to see what happens in between the keyframes. And so I can get there by clicking on this little EKG-looking icon right here. So it takes me to the F-Curve. But there's a better way to do that. With my mouse over the F-Curve Manager, I can hit the space bar to go back and forth. So now, in the F-Curve Manager, I want to be able to see the curves for this first sphere default. And so if I click on that default, I now see some colored lines over here. And these colored lines represent the curves. Now, I'm only seeing part of the line, so I want to be able to see them all. So I'm going to use that Frame All command. So if I go to the Frame menu again and use Frame All, I also hit the letter H on the keyboard. Now I'm seeing the entire curves. And so the curves are color coordinated to go along with the axes that they represent, X, Y, Z, R, G, B. The x-axis is always red, and so by looking at the curve, I can see exactly what my object is doing. It's moving in time from one position to another, and it's moving, starting off slow, and it's coming to a slow stop. And the reason I know this is because of the numbers that are showing here. The numbers across the top of the F-Curve Manager represent the time value. The numbers across the left-hand side represent the keyframe value. And these keyframe values will change depending on the type of keyframes you're looking at. In this case, we're looking at position frames, and so we're seeing position values here. So the default interpolation method, soft, has created this nice, smooth animation for me. And what I want to be able to do now is to change these animations and make the ball behave in a different way. So what I've done is I've copied this ball and just moved it down one. And I'm going to activate the next ball by holding down the Option key and clicking on these two red dots. And that turns them both gray at the same time. So now, if I hit play, you'll see I have two spheres moving exactly the same way. Now, if I stop playback there, what I would like to do now is have the second ball move in a linear fashion. A linear move does not slow and does not speed up and slow down again when it comes into the keyframe. It moves in a constant rate from one keyframe to another. So in order to do that, I need to first find the F-curves for that linear object. So in order to see those F-curves, I need to click on the linear object. Now I'm seeing the curves for that linear object. I want to select all these keyframes so I can drag a rectangle around a couple of them, then hit Command or Control A to grab all the keyframes. And now I can right-click in the interface to get a contextual menu. And at the very top is a linear command. If I execute that, it removes the tangent handles off of the keyframes and makes them into a linear curve. And so now when I hit play, you'll see the balls behave very differently. So what's happening here is both balls are starting and stopping at the same time, but they're traveling between those start and stop points at very different rates. The bottom ball is moving at a constant speed. The top ball is starting off with a very slow move and then speeding up and then slowing down again as it hits its mark. But they both hit their mark at the same time. So next up is something called an ease in. And in order to understand what an ease in is, you have to think about what keyframes really mean. To the computer, keyframes are really just a spreadsheet. And there's data flowing into and out of that spreadsheet. And so when you hear the term ease in and ease out, you're really talking about data flowing into and out of a keyframe. So data travels through the timeline from left to right. So an ease in is what's coming into a keyframe from the left-hand side, and ease out is what's happening out of the keyframe from the right-hand side. So let's make an ease in. I'm going to activate the ease in ball. And the ease in ball, when I select the curves, they've been made linear, and I made them linear using the exact same technique that I did on that linear ball just a moment ago. So now what I want to do is create an ease in. If I draw a rectangle around those guys, I can create an ease in by right-clicking and going to the spline types and doing ease in. And you can see what happens is now I have a linear move here and a very smooth stop. So let's see what that looks like when we hit play. So the ball starts off at the same rate as the linear ball, but then it has to slow down as it makes its mark. And if I select the ease in ball, you can see if I hit play again, it'll make it easier to identify. They all hit their mark at the exact same time. So let's take a look at the next one, ease out. I'm going to activate it by holding down the Option key and clicking on both dots. And then I'm going to select the curves for that. And these are linearized just like the previous one. So I want to grab these keyframes, right-click, and do spline types, ease out. And the ease out function now creates an ease out of the keyframe. So you can see that we've got handles now and an easing out of the keyframe. So it starts off with a very smooth stop, and then it created a smooth stop over here. So if I want to go back here, I can fix this by right-clicking and going to spline types, 0 angle, 0 length. And that will create a linear stop for me. So I have a smooth start and a linear stop the way I intended. So let's click play, and I'll click on the ease out ball. So you can see they still hit their mark at the same time, but the ease out is taking off with a very smooth start and coming in hard on its mark. Next up is the easy ease. And if you're an After Effects user, you'll remember that easy ease is a phrase from After Effects. And it allows you to create a very smooth animation in After Effects, and it works great. And so Cinema 4D programmers created a move that's very similar to that here in the application. So I'm going to go to the easy ease object. Let's make it visible first. And then I'll select it here so we can see it's playing back. Here in the F-Curve Manager, if I click on Easy Ease, it's got linear keyframes on it, just like the other ones. I'm going to select all the keyframes, Command or Control A, and then I'm going to go to Spline Types, Easy Ease. And when I let go of that, I get a keyframe that looks pretty much like the default. And so when I hit play, you'll see that the default object and the Easy Ease object are moving in exactly the same way. Next up is something called a hold keyframe, and a hold keyframe is really more like a switch than a keyframe. The object is going to hold its position until the next keyframe, and then it's going to pop just like that and snap to the next keyframe. So let's make that visible and see what it looks like. I'll make the hold object visible, and then I'll select it so we can see it a little easier. Now down in the F-Curve Manager, I'm going to click on the hold object and linearize keyframes just like before. I'm going to select these outgoing keyframes and right-click and go to Step. And a step is what we, in After Effects lingo, would be called a hold keyframe. So if we hit play, you'll see that the object now will snap into position. It holds its mark and snap. Boom. So all of the objects are still hitting their mark at the same time. It's just that this one waits and waits and waits and boom, jumps right into position. The last up is the clamp. And I'm going to hold down the Option key and make the clamp visible, select it here so we can watch it a little bit better. And then I'll click on the clamp object down here in the F-Curve Manager to see its curves. Now, when I made this, I actually created separate keyframes for a pause here, and this object should be hitting its mark. Let's see what it's doing by default. These are the default keyframes that I got when I first made the animation for the clamp object. So when I hit play, you can see that instead of pausing, it's doing this yo-yo effect. And so the yo-yo effect is not desirable in this case. I want to have it actually pause. And so there's a great function for that called clamp. So if I right-click in the interface and select the clamp option flattens out the curves and makes the yo-yo effect go away. So now when I hit play, as you can see, when I hit play now, the clamp ball hits its mark, pauses, and then continues on and catches up with the rest of its buddies. Last up is custom tangents. And I'll make the custom tangents ball visible, select it here, and click on the custom tangents F-curves. And right now I have them on by default. And really the custom tangents are just taking the handles and moving them any which way you want. And one of the great things about the F-Curve Manager is that if I move these curves, I have a direct impact on what the animation does and how it behaves. So if I twirl open the F-Curve for the custom tangents, I'm going to twirl open position, and I'm just going to focus on position X. So if I click position X. Now I've isolated that F curve. And I can take these tangent handles, and I'm going to select just this one on the left side, and I can move that curve up. And I can create effects very similar to the commands up above, but I'm doing them in a manual way. And I'm doing them in a way that gives me a much more extreme effect than it did before. So I'll move this into something that looks a lot like the ease in. So if I move this up to ease in, I want to be careful not to go above that red line. Now when I hit play, watch the custom tangents ball. It's going to come into a much slower stop than it did before. So let me stop playback again. I can also take this tangent and do it way down here, and my object will actually go backwards and then come back and catch up with its buddies. So we've been looking at this animation in a little top view up in the upper left-hand corner. I'm going to switch my layout back to standard just so we can get a bigger view of it. And I'll switch to standard layout here. And I've still got the top view full screen here. I'll deselect the custom tangents ball, and we'll watch them all play back in real time here. When I hit play, so as you can see, all of these balls are animated with the same two basic keyframes, except for the clamp ball. But they're moving in very different ways, and that's all thanks to the power of the F-Curve Manager.